The Unbroken Place podcast with Eddie Paul Thomas is a production of Say Something Studios. I'd love to hear from you kind of what first caused you to seriously question the teachings about women that you had growing up within the church.
Well, I had always been taught that you can understand the plain reading of the word, and there are some passages that definitely appear to restrict women, and so I took that at face value. I had not ever had like a hermeneutics course or something like that that taught me some of the challenges of translation and interpretation. So I just took the plain reading. And then I saw an explanation one time, maybe 7 years ago, that pointed out that if you interpret this verse to be saying with that restriction, then it contradicts other scripture. And that really got me going, because I was like, wait a minute, we dive into every other topic where there's an apparent discrepancy because, we believe that the Bible doesn't contradict itself. And so why have I never heard an explanation for this apparent contradiction?
75%. That's the exact percentage of people in the Southern Baptist Convention's recent annual meeting who voted to silence women. They advanced the Truth and Unity Amendment, a constitutional decision that formally draws a line in the sand, banning cooperating churches from affirming, endorsing, or allowing women to step into any pastoral role or function, including preaching. Welcome to the Unbroken Place, where it begins and ends with empathy. I'm your host, Eddie Paul Thomas, and by now, if you listen to the show, you should know where I stand, and you know that this is a safe place for all kinds of conversations. I rarely find myself agreeing with conservative politics or religion, but sometimes an issue transcends theological differences. Sometimes the truth demands that we find common ground to understand and focus on what matters most. And in this case, it's elevating the voices of women who have been systematically silenced by misleading tactics and restrictive doctrines. Joining me today in the Unbroken Place is Lydia Kaiser, a brilliant theologian who's looked at all of the structures that are holding women back within the church and decided to expose the roots. She's the author of the eye-opening book, Bible Truth About Women, What They Don't Tell You. So let's get into it. Okay. Thank you so much for joining us today, Lydia. The book that you've put out, I really enjoyed reading through it. I'm probably going to have to go through it about 3 or 4 more times just to make sure I have everything correct in terms of your viewpoint. But that's also why you're here, to kind of make sure that the things that you are writing about, people have a clear understanding of. The book is called Bible Truth About Women. And our guest today is Lydia Kaiser. Is that correct? Did I say it correctly?
That's right.
Kaiser.
Thank you for having me, Eddie. And the important part of the title is Bible Truth About Women, What They Don't Tell You, because these are things that you will not hear in church.
Outstanding. Well, let's start with some questions that I think would be central to just understanding you as a writer, like why this was an important project to you. I'd love to hear from you kind of what first caused you to seriously question the teachings about women that you had growing up within the church.
Well, I had always been taught that you can understand the plain reading of the word, and there are some passages that definitely appear to restrict women, and so I took that at face value. I had not ever had like a hermeneutics course or something like that taught me some of the challenges of translation and interpretation. So I just took the plain reading. And then I saw an explanation one time, maybe 7 years ago, that pointed out that if you interpret this verse to be saying with that restriction, then it contradicts other scripture. And that really got me going, because I was like, wait a minute, we dive into every other topic where there's an apparent discrepancy, because, we believe that the
Hmm.
Bible doesn't contradict itself. And so why have I never heard an explanation for this apparent contradiction? And so I looked into it more and realized that this particular verse probably should have been in quotation marks in 1 Corinthians 14, because all throughout 1 Corinthians, Paul is quoting errant people and then refuting them. And I was like, well, if we've done that with this verse, what about the other verses that seem to have apparent restrictions to women? I wonder if we've failed to really look into those adequately as well. So it just began a
Yeah.
journey of really trying to, um, for me, because I believe the Bible. I believe the Bible is authoritative, and it should make sense, and we shouldn't dismiss things like apparent discrepancies without learning more.
Yeah. Yeah. I think specifically for women, I think there are a lot of challenges in the Bible that, we're obviously going to unpack a lot of these during the conversation today, but there are things that, for me growing up, that I read that I was not taught as a young man, that I later kind of questioned the logic and what was going on back then, because my background is in history and sociology. Um, that didn't quite make sense in the Bible in terms of the way women are viewed today. The silent nature in which a lot of men in power want women to have in the church, and it didn't quite make sense. So I'm again really glad that you're here to kind of help us unpack some of that.
Thank you.
Um, one thing I did want to jump into before we go into some of the really interesting aspects of the book. Throughout the book, you describe yourself as deeply conservative and committed to Bible authority. Why was that important for you to make that, clear throughout the book?
Well, because there's always this accusation that you just want the Bible to say this, and so you're biased, and we all feel like it should be that people are equal. I've heard some of the most restrictive men admit that it just doesn't feel right. But this is what God's
Hmm.
word says, so by golly, I've got to obey it. And I understand that. But, you know, I wanted to reassure those particular people that this is not a conviction that I've arrived at because I've decided to toss out a few verses, or that maybe the Bible really isn't authoritative, or maybe it's really not authoritative for today, and because this is how I feel, and times have changed. None of that. I i truly came to this conclusion by studying the actual scriptures, the original languages, and the arguments by excellent scholars regarding the original languages, and why we have um, not been as careful with it in this regard as we should have.
Interesting. So, if I'm understanding you, your thought is that when you say conservative, it's not necessarily a reflection on politics, but more on how you view the Bible.
Right.
Is that
Right.
fair?
So evangelical, with the understanding that evangelicals have put a high regard on the inerrancy and the authority of the Word of God. However, I'm starting to feel like we almost worshipped the Bible instead of worshiping God.
That you're headed towards my next question.
We just,
I'm so sorry. Go ahead.
because of not, I always heard that the Bible is inerrant in the original languages.
Hmm.
However, I still put way too much stock in the English words because that's all I knew. And I trusted those
Yeah.
translators that,
Yeah.
they would say, well, this is a word for word translation. And, you know, there's no such thing. you know, now I understand there's really no such thing. And so
Yeah.
we all put way too much stock in the English words. And, now we have all these versions, and that shows that people think, perhaps we're not doing the best that we could do with the translation. Otherwise, why would they think we need another version? And of course,
Yeah.
language is always changing, and we need to acknowledge that language has changed since, you know, we've been reading these English words. So, yeah.
Well, languages changes, cultures change. There's when working with a lot of missionaries, like I have over the last several years, the way in which the Bible and its teachings are taught are very different in Mexico as opposed to Sudan, as opposed to somewhere within in China. I mean, their culture has so much to do with the way in which people understand the word as well.
Right. So we're not saying, well, culture has changed, so God's word is less reliable or has changed. What we're saying is we need to understand the culture of the people who are hearing the word and how they are interpreting what they're hearing based on their particular bias or the connotations that come with those particular words for them, and so on.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. So I want to dig in. I have so many other questions, but I loved that you approached the topic and would love to dig in a little bit more in terms of worshiping the Bible. Could you unpack that a little bit more, just in terms of what your thinking was on that?
Sure. Well, we always said, well, the Bible says, and then we quote this
Hmm.
English verse,
Hmm.
and we don't allow for any nuance with those particular words. And perhaps,
Yeah.
you know, we could get into this more later, perhaps, but like the word head, our understanding, our cultural understanding of the word head is like a CEO, the boss. He's the head of this
Hmm.
organization. That is not even typical or common in all Western societies. I mean, I was shocked to learn that French people, when you say head to them, that doesn't mean the top person. They're thinking of a literal head, and they don't have the same metaphor. And yet we, as English speaking Americans, hear the word head, and so we say, "Oh, there it is in the Bible."
Hmm.
So learning more about how the word head was used in the first century, how it was
Yeah.
used by the Greeks. I mean, the New Testament was written in Greek. Shouldn't we be looking at how the Greeks understood and used the word head in even other secular Greek literature?
Yeah. Yeah. I think as I've kind of grown and started to have conversations with people across the globe in terms of the Bible and their thoughts and how it's been interpreted within their cultural context, and whether it's English or not, there I've learned a little bit more about the identity politics that play into how the Bible is read. There are some who are literalists about what's in the Bible, and I would ask a question, tongue in cheek, but then it sparks a really big conversation. If you're a Bible literalist, then how do you have your eyes and ears? Because if you've sinned with your eyes,
Cut them
supposed to
off
gouge it
or
out.
pluck
If
them out,
you've
right?
sinned with your hand, you're supposed to cut it off. Like you're picking and choosing here. So either you should be walking around with an eye patch and one hand, or we have to negotiate and kind of understand what's inside this book and what it's trying to teach us. I could say the same about Lot's choice with his daughters. Take my daughter. Like, is that acceptable in the real world right now? Of course not. So the I I I have to, from time to time, kind of take with a grain of salt, not necessarily you, obviously, but just individuals who use the Bible to push something as opposed to engage in a conversation with it, if that makes any sense.
Right. Well, just because something's in the Bible doesn't mean it's endorsed, that it was prescribed, that God was in favor of it. It's a report. what was happening.
Right.
And also there's just so much inconsistency with picking and choosing. Like in one chapter, someone will say, well, um, head coverings and that are are just cultural. We don't have to worry about that. But in the same passage, uh, they'll say, well, this is for now, you know, 2 verses later, you know,
Yeah.
or or five
Yeah.
verses later, you know, that's
Yeah.
only for then. And so again, we're not really handling things consistent. There are a lot of clues, like whether something is a metaphor, whether there's a like or as type of thing, and whether it's truly figurative speech or if it's more literal. Perhaps whether it's referred to as if it were literal by Jesus or someone else in the Bible. So there's some other criteria. We don't have
Yeah.
to say, well, because I'm saying that Jesus didn't literally mean pluck your eye out and chop your hand off. He was just being, that was just a hyperbole. That doesn't mean I have to throw out everything else. So,
Oh,
yeah.
right.
So, again, just really thoughtful consideration on these things rather than just being too
Yeah.
quick to say, well, the Bible, these words say this, therefore.
Yeah. I think you and I could stay here all day just kind of picking through some of the different things and the ideologies that come from these discussions. But I do want to go more specifically to your book. In particular, in the introduction, you share several meaningful, painful, even real life stories. Was there a particular story or experience that became the emotional catalyst for writing this book?
Well, you might notice that the book is dedicated to my mother. And
Hmm.
my father was a pastor, and my mother was a brilliant woman. She graduated magna cum laude from Wheaton,
Mm,
and
okay.
but by the time my father was done with her, she was just an accessory. I heard him offering, in job interviews, you hire me, you get her for free, and here's all the things she can do. Meanwhile, there's 6 of us kids who need attention. And so our mother was just used terribly and abused, with it in every way, and but mostly spiritually abused because she was told over and over, and all of us girls were, that because you're female, you don't get to have an opinion. You need to shut your sassy mouth if you're expressing an opinion, and the only reason we need to go to college would be to get our MRS degree, so you can find the man that, do you know what the MRS degree is?
No, I was getting ready to ask
Oh,
you what's the MLS?
Mrs.
Oh, jeez. Oh my
Yeah,
gosh. Oh,
you go find the man that you're going to support for the rest of your life. That's your
okay.
only purpose of going to the Christian college.
Oh my
And
gosh.
so,
Okay. At the expense of sounding exceedingly politically incorrect, what time frame are we, like 80s,
oh,
70s,
I'm 59
90s?
years old, so that would have
Okay.
been the 80s. Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And I've listened to, so there's a gentleman who's also published a book on this subject recently. And I was listening to his life story, and it matched mine perfectly in that we both grew up just loving the Bible. By the time I was in high school, I was memorizing entire books of the Bible. I wrote my research papers on biblical topics and that sort of thing. He was
Hmm.
encouraged to, go to preacher boys college and to go to seminary right out of college. I was encouraged to, you know, get an art degree because that might help some Christian ministry in a support way, you know. So as I'm listening to his story and thinking about my story and the fact that we've not just now both published a book on this topic, I'm thinking we took different roads to get here.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. I think it's incredible. I really am grateful for books like yours that challenge the status quo, that challenge power dynamics.
Well, here I am
Um, with,
finally. in seminary in my 50s.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
didn't do it in my 20s. I didn't think that it was appropriate, and besides, I would have been challenged. What do you think you're doing here? Every time I turned around at that point. Now there are more women in seminaries, and it's a good thing because there's a huge shortage of pastors out there. So uh,
Interesting. So, in your view, is it necessary for one to go to seminary to be a pastor?
no, actually, that's one uh, place where I go in the book is explain that these titles that the churches come up with,
Hmm.
are taken from these very humble. Paul looked for the most servant-oriented words that he could,
Right.
and then the
Yeah.
church just took those and made them into titles, and then turned Paul's intention on its head by, excluding some people from being able to hold those, positions. Just like 1 Timothy 3, it says if anyone or any man in some versions desires the office of a bishop or an overseer or whatever, there's no such thing as there's no word for office in there. They just decided, well, it would make it sound smoother if we put this word office in there. And Paul was not
Yeah.
about offices. And now we have the largest denomination, Protestant denomination in our country, has
Hmm.
been voting year after year trying to pass an amendment to their constitution that women may not have the word pastor in their title, even if it's to be women's ministry pastor or children's pastor. So they've taken that word and made their most important title out of it. And then and that's fine. They can do whatever they want. It's their denomination. They can pick any title out of the air and make it the most important title. Here's the problem. They say, as scripture qualifies, and they say over and over that this is what the Bible teaches. And you ask anyone in that denomination, does the Bible actually say that women may not be pastors? Oh, yes. It's got to be in there somewhere. you know.
Right. Well, yeah, and that's one of the things that as I look at what the church is today, um, in the West specifically, it always concerns me because whether you can name the social issue, you can even name issues within the church, and it comes back to, in my opinion, um, the Great Commission was not to go out and make followers. It was to go out and to make disciples. But instead, what we have are these huge denominations of followers of Christ who are not very well educated in the word. There's no critical thinking about the word. It's more, well, my pastor said, and I'm taking all these lessons from the pastor, as opposed to I'm in my Bible study group, or I'm connected with some sort of outlet in which I'm doing the deeper dive on what's in the Bible, and how I should live my life according to the Bible. And I think it's making a lot of, and at the chance of upsetting a lot of people listening right now, it's making the body weaker. I
Right. A
mean,
mile wide and an inch deep. And
yeah,
and I'm
it
realizing that I
exactly.
didn't really quite finish answering your question.
I'm so
No,
sorry.
no,
Yeah.
I've kind of got off and forgot what your question was, but you had asked, do I really think that people need to be a pastor? And um, what I like to tell a lot of women that I talk to, God's put people in your life that you're looking after them. You're shepherding them.
Hmm.
That is what pastor
Yes.
is as a shepherd. And
Yes.
Jesus is the great shepherd, and we also, as we follow Jesus, we are shepherding others, and
Hmm.
so you know you go pastor these people that God has put in your life, and don't wait for someone to come into your life and formally ordain you as a pastor. You just do the gift. It's a gifting. You read those that list of gifts, and that's what it is, and the only place where it's listed. And how many women do you know who are just especially good at shepherding people? So to say that women should not have this title, unquote, is awful.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah,
hurting the
I agree
church.
with that. Yeah. I think the obsession with titles is really an obsession with power. And
Absolutely.
there are themes of mutuality that we'll get to in your book that I fully wholeheartedly agree with in terms of, and this is talking to someone who, in my studies of history and as I've kind of grown in my understanding of some of the things within the Bible, have looked at, the Vedas. I've read the Vedas. I've also read the Quran, and I understand. Okay, well, these things have been the same for a really long time. However, the Bible has 54 different versions and tons of different languages, and instead of pulling from the themes and creating a healthy body, we're actually creating more divisions. And I really I've never understood the idea that when you take the role of women, and guys, I hope you hear this. I don't care if you hear my heart. I want you to hear the facts. And we go back to your dad's time frame in the 80s. Women were smart enough to be our mothers and teach us everything we know up until we're 5, 6 years old. Then we go to kindergarten through 8th grade, and we are being taught by women. And I'm talking about in the 80s here, guys. We're being taught everything: science, religion, art, history by our female teachers. And then we go to high school, and the overwhelming majority of teachers in high schools were female. So they're the smartest, most educated people are teaching us everything we need to know. And then we go out into the world, and it's supposed to be men leading the way. Wait, hold on. Who were we just taught by? And why can this not move over into the church? Why is it that they cannot lead us in ways that help make the world better, especially in the West? I mean, imagine. I won't go there. Sorry. Let's
Well, and just
that's
look
a
at the example
whole.
of Jesus. I think with every question, we need to start there, because too often we start with the epistles and then we interpret Jesus based on what we think the epistles say, when really those authors were followers of Jesus, not the other way around. Something we shouldn't have to say, but yeah, let's start with Jesus. He had no problem listening to his mother in his, when he was 30 years old. And he's at first he protested and said, this is not my time, or whatever his objection was. But then he relented and he performed his very first miracle at her request.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
it was a good thing. And it also just showed how Jesus loves weddings and he loves parties. And, he was like, yeah, this actually is a good time to do my first miracle. And he submitted to his mother in that. And I don't know how old he was when Joseph died, but I imagine that he stayed in the home a lot longer than other young men did, because he was needed, and that he cooperated with her until the day he turned it over to his next oldest brother and left the home. So, yeah, look at the example of Jesus.
Don't go anywhere. The Unbroken Place will be back in just a moment. What if the clarity you've been searching for isn't out there, but already within you? I'm Eddie Paul Thomas, life and leadership coach. I work with purpose-driven people who are ready to lead boldly, live intentionally, and grow from the inside out. Whether you're at a crossroads or leveling up, coaching can help you move with focus, confidence, and wisdom. This is your time. Visit onsecondthoughtstudio.com to get started. Imagine a place where the untold stories of Black missionaries are amplified, honored, and celebrated. A place that bridges the legacy of the people of the Way with the powerful missions work of today's African diaspora. Welcome to the Black Missions Museum, a digital project dedicated to preserving the voices, culture, and legacy of Black missionaries across the globe. But we need your help to bring this vision to life. Your support makes a difference. Join us in this mission by donating today. Just click the link in the show notes to give and be a part of history. Together, we can inspire future generations and keep the legacy alive.
In a world where thriving teams, engaged managers, and ethical leaders are the backbone of successful business, how do entrepreneurs set the stage for human flourishing while scaling up? The answer is ongoing effort, leadership, and intentional communication. At Elevate One Consulting, Dr. Erica Garcia Thomas and Eddie Paul Thomas are helping to turn the tide. With a blend of evidence-based practices, interactive teaching, and dynamic public speaking, they're not just consultants, but revolutionaries in improving company health, growth results, and employee engagement. Specializing in revitalizing brands, coaching leaders, and accelerating projects, Elevate One Consulting offers a comprehensive suite of business services designed to enhance team leadership and customer experience. Whether advising executives, guiding digital marketing strategies, or transforming organizational culture, they're here to elevate your business to the next level. Don't settle for a business that survives. Ensure that it thrives. Visit www.elevateoneconsulting.com. ELEVATE 1consulting.com today and take the first step towards creating an environment where everyone flourishes. Elevate One Consulting. Innovate, grow, elevate.
Looking for a way to reconnect and reset? Awaken Pittsburgh offers free guided meditations open to everyone, online and in person, on the first and third Wednesday, second Saturday, and third Monday of each month. Each session includes guided practice, reflection, and space for questions and support. No experience needed. Sign up on Eventbrite and join the community.
At the Say Something Studios division of Elevate One Consulting, we don't just build websites, we craft unforgettable digital experiences. Imagine a place where design, development, UX, SEO, and management harmonize to elevate your brand to unprecedented exposure. A place where your website is not just seen, but felt, experienced, and remembered. Our expert team, equipped with unparalleled marketing insight, turns the everyday task of website design and management into a seamless, empowering journey. With Elevate One, you're not just launching a website, you're embarking on a transformative business adventure. We meticulously design every aspect, from intuitive navigation to stunning graphics, ensuring your digital space authentically represents your business ethos. Ready to transform your online presence into a thriving digital masterpiece? Visit us now at www.elevateoneconsulting.com and start your journey to digital excellence. Elevate One Consulting. Innovate, grow, elevate. And we're back. I love that. So I'm good. Again, we could go off into 30 different branches with regard to this, but I know that in your book specifically, you argue that hierarchy between men and women is a result of the fall rather than God's original design. Why is that distinction so important to you?
Because there really is no evidence that there was a hierarchy before the fall. People have tried to read that into the passage and say, well, because Adam was created first, or because it appears that God went to Adam first after the fall or something like that, that somehow implies that he had leadership. But there are other good explanations why Adam would have been created first. Perhaps God just knew he needed an object lesson on how much he needed his counterpart so that he wouldn't think that it was all him. And also just the unity and the one flesh thing. If he had created both of them out of separate matter, Adam out of this lump of clay or dirt and Eve out of this lump of clay or dirt, there wouldn't be quite the one flesh unity there. Let's think about, there's so many, so I won't get off on that. But when God is telling Eve what the consequences of their sin will be, one of the three things he tells her, this is in the top 3 terrible things that are going to happen to you, is that you are going to turn toward, your desire will be toward your husband. However, he will rule over you. And that's a negative, nasty word there. And so God is predicting a bad thing. And somehow people have twisted that and said that her desire was ugly, which we could get off into that if you wanted to, or that she somehow needed that, and that was the answer to the sin problem. But, we take the other things as being negative, the toil, the labor that they would have now, the sorrow of raising children. Those are negative, sad things that are happening. And the fact that her husband is going to, rule over her instead of co-ruling the world with her, God brought them together, and together he gave them dominion over the earth. And so I believe that's the ideal, that they would mutually look at each other and say, hey, we're different and we need someone different. So that was the ideal, and what we should be trying to work toward again. But it fell apart with sin, because once sin came in, and we're all selfish, and people grab power wherever they can. And God warned her this would happen. So why are we surprised?
Yeah. So I would say there's a good number of my listeners that are not Christian.
Okay.
And are maybe they're trying to tie the knot here, like, or find the links between what's going on today as opposed to what you're describing with Adam and Eve that led to where things are today. Could you kind of clear that up for them, just in as short a way as possible?
Like, you want me to tell the Genesis story, or I'm not sure what you're looking for.
I guess I would say, as you read that story of Adam and Eve, I personally know from reading and from the lessons I was taught as a young man, that a lot of things were heaped on Eve. Like, oh, she is the cause of all of this. And there was never really any question of that. And I can see those lessons as a young man filtering into what older men are interpreting as, well, women need to be led. And I want to offer a counter to that, but I'd love to hear your counter as opposed to Eddie's machinations.
Okay. So the narrative in Genesis is that they're living happily in the garden, and they happen upon this beautiful creature who tempts them with power and authority, being like God, and knowledge, and all these wonderful things. And the way I was told the story is that Eve yielded to temptation, ate the fruit that God had told them not to eat, ran and found Adam and said, look, it's delicious. And wow, I suddenly know so much more. And Adam did not want to be without his precious Eve. And so he joined her in the sin. And so from then on, she is the wicked temptress that is more inclined to sin and needs to be led, lest she fall into more sin, greater sin. And you read these sort of things by Reformation leaders such as Martin Luther, saying that, the woman needs to be led lest she sin more. Actually, if you really believe in every word of the original text being, the inerrant word of God, the creature that was speaking to them used the plural you. Now, we don't have that in English. When you say you, we have to look and see, well, are you looking at more than one person? Other languages will have the plural you and the singular you. We don't. So when you translate that into English and it says you, English speakers would think, oh, he's speaking to Eve. However, now that we know it's a plural you, he's standing right there. And there's another indication that Adam was with her. Anyway, now most versions say she gave to her husband who was with her. But when Jerome translated that into Latin, the Latin Vulgate, which was used as a basis for many other versions throughout the Middle Ages, he left out, he did not put in there that Adam was with her. And so, again, you start with a base of misconception like that the woman was the first sinner, the evil temptress, and that God had to make Adam her ruler in order to keep her in line. And then you pile that on through centuries of history. What do you get? Even in the church, it turns into misogyny.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I know that specifically in your book, you spoke to Jesus's treatment of women as a central argument. What did you discover about Jesus that changed or deepened your own faith while writing this book?
Well, just little things like that in Luke 8, where it mentions all the women and it calls them disciples. Akalatheo is a Greek word for disciple that would have been used in the first century for those who were formally following certain rabbis. And so it would have been a shocking word, actually, because those rabbis wouldn't have allowed women to follow them. And yet Luke described these women with akalatheo. They were actual disciples. We get this picture in our heads based on these visuals that were held up for us as children. Here's the disciples, and they're all male. And so we hear the word disciples, and we just think about the 12. And some people say, well, Jesus didn't choose any women to be among the 12. Well, again, we're talking about a patriarchal society. We're talking about the symbolism of the 12 tribes. So Jesus he wasn't out to, and neither was Paul, out to cause slaves and women to riot in the streets. The gospel would become something entirely different if there was an emphasis like that. What Jesus and Paul were counting on is that the example of Jesus and the teaching of the gospel would change our hearts, and then we would treat others like we should. And I think that is evident throughout what Jesus did. He undermined the patriarchy at every turn. He disobeyed all of the illegitimate laws, almost an in-your-face way, like with the woman with the issue of blood. He had her admit in front of everyone that here she is out of her home while menstruating, and that she had actually touched his garment. How dare she? I mean, think of the other men standing there. If this woman had touched them, how horrified they would be. And yet Jesus then commended her in front of everyone. It was like we just don't get the same the feeling of what it would have really been like in that time with these interactions with Jesus when he was in the Pharisee's home and he told the Pharisee, look at this woman. There were some Pharisees, they were called the bruised Pharisees, because they would not actually look at women. They would avert their gaze and bump into walls rather than look at a woman. And so they would get bruises on them. And
Yeah.
so, Jesus was allowing these women to travel with him, and he was touching them, speaking to them, commending them. At every turn, he was breaking the Pharisaical fence laws in order
Hmm.
to elevate them. Yeah.
Yeah. It's always struck me, even from a young age, that among his disciples, he did not choose a Pharisee. He didn't choose a scholar amongst the group. It was more, you had the zealots and you had the tax collector, and
The
it was,
fishermen. Yeah.
yeah, the fisherman. It just it's always been interesting to me to see how that turns out in Western culture as opposed to Eastern cultures, where it is more of an egalitarian way of learning about the Bible and sharing stories with others. It's just very interesting. I know that you also spend a really good amount of time addressing the problem passages in Paul's letters. Why do you think these few passages have carried so much weight in church culture today?
Because certain people wanted them to. There's the short answer.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
I've been criticized for my book being about, because I talk about what I do in the book is I take 20 categories of misleading tactics that have been
Hmm.
used by translators and interpreters uh, in the passages regarding women, and show how a lot of this was intentional. And that's hard to say. Even now it's hard for me to say, but it has to be. They know what they're doing. They know. I just used this word, this Greek word with a man and proestemi, and translated it rule, but over here there's women, so I'm gonna translate it to give aid. you know and so there's inconsistency. There's, for years I never knew that Phoebe was the word. I saw the word servant in Romans 16:1 affiliated with Phoebe. I didn't know that in the Greek it was diakonos, and that those same translators, when the word is with a male, it's translated deacon. And so the inconsistencies, they are
Hmm.
intentional. So
Yeah.
that's the short answer. Certain people want to hold power and make sure that they, don't let those wild, evil seductresses have too much say in the church.
Yeah. Yeah. I've seen so many things, with regard to exactly what you're saying. The way in which things were intentionally done to set things up the way that they are right now. One of which I spoke about in my book, A Broken Seat at the Table, where one of the examples I cited was the creation of the slave Bible, where verses were literally removed
Right.
so that as the enslaved would read, they wouldn't see, oh, Moses and the Israelites,
And didn't they
left
take
their
out the
bondage.
entire book of Exodus because they didn't want,
Yeah,
yeah, they
yeah, yeah.
didn't want people getting ideas.
Exactly. Don't get ideas about your liberation through
Right.
Christ or through
It's
the
it's
Bible.
really horrible
You
what
know.
has been done throughout history to use
Yeah.
the Bible. It's spiritual abuse to use the Bible as a weapon. And it's God's
Hmm.
precious word. And God will hold people accountable. But meanwhile, we need to speak the truth, even if it costs us personally.
Yeah. Yeah. I I've sat with a lot of pastors, it's specifically in 2025 about this topic, and I saw so many ways in which the Bible is being abused for political purposes, for people to manipulate their large audiences. And one of the things that I cited to them was, guys, there are people who are in mass exodus from the church right now.
Yeah.
In mass exodus, because
Ask yourself why.
the question is why, but I always ask them, do you understand that people can see what you're doing? There's what you say, but then there's what you're doing that kind of, makes people kind of second guess, like, okay, if I can't trust this guy who's on the stage or this gal who's on the stage telling me that the Bible says this, but then I go and read that chapter and I read it in context with everything around it, and it doesn't say that at all. Why would I continue going to this church? And then you go to this church down the street and they're doing something similar, just in a different way. It creates a lack of trust in what is being taught, and you start to see people leave through the doors.
Well, it hurts everyone.
Yeah.
This bias against women has hurt men as well. It took,
Yeah,
the words for
absolutely.
Eve when God brought Eve to Adam, Azer Kenegdo, is a powerful ally, is a strong collaborator, and for him
Yeah.
to for it to be translated as a suitable helper, well, like she's good enough, he's lost his partner, and so from then on, all this pressure is put on the man to perform well because he's supposed to be the be all and end all and have all the answers, and if anything goes wrong, it's all on him, and she's been told that this is the case. So she's like, okay, I'll play along with the game. It's your fault. And he's lost his partner. And then in passages like Ephesians 5, where the verse 3, it talks about Paul teaching it. That same word for teach is used down later. And when it says everyone should bring a teaching, oh no, you men sit down because you're not the pastor. You're not the head honcho here. We have to have a hierarchy here. So they're not only holding back the women, they're holding back the men. And then they say, well, you have to be married. First Timothy 3 says that you have to be the husband of one wife. That means you got to be married. So no unmarried men can be on our elder board. So everywhere you look, there has been damage done to everyone. I didn't even
Yeah.
know that verse was in that. I always thought it was a little odd when I was growing up, the verse that said that some of the worst sins that someone could commit, one of them included kidnapping. And I thought, well, how odd. How many times do we look around and see kidnapping happening? Well, never. And it wasn't until later I learned that, well, that's slave trading. But they downplayed it. They hid it. They obfuscated it. And so, yeah, people say, well, the Bible doesn't teach against slavery. Well, it absolutely does.
Yeah. Well, that's where we get into the Bible contradicts itself conversations, where individuals, you can literally find spots in the Bible that teach against slavery. And then there are parts where it says, okay, you may have slaves as long as they're not Israelite. Like there are different parts that cause individuals to kind of go to their separate corners on a certain topic, and it does from time to time really force an individual to think about, again, the Bible literalism. Do I take it as, every single part of this book I've
If
got to
God doesn't
follow it?
condemn it every time it's mentioned, then it must be okay, I guess, because we can't broaden our minds or our historical understanding to find out what was going on there.
Yeah. It's going to be an interesting thing in my lifetime if it ever happens, because there are multiple translations of the Bible, but I'm always curious to see if there is a body that says, you know what, well, it's not interesting to see, it's already happening. There are groups that are saying that, there's seriously problematic parts of the Bible, and maybe we need to convene the commission that changes some of these things for the benefit of the formerly enslaved, the people who are being human trafficked, women, the LGBTQAI plus community, like all of these different groups. have been looking for the modification, or at least the change of how things are viewed, and it's
Yeah, and I'm
some of it,
concerned
it's
about
hard
that
sometimes.
because, once we start modifying the Bible, maybe we just need to teach it better. We take some of these issues. Um, you could probably help me think of a few where there's apparent discrepancies, and we find every possible mention and every possibility of why this was said this way, and you know ad nauseum. And then and then when the pastor is preaching through that passage, they'll pull all that in to give the congregant, the parishioners, the bird's eye view of all these things that affect why it says this right here. But we've
Hmm.
neglected to do that in some other cases. And so again, I think that's teaching. And back to your question about, does everyone have to be a pastor? I would like to see everybody at least take a hermeneutics class. I mean,
Hmm.
for me to not understand what I learned from hermeneutics until I was in my 50s is not good, because I was brought up in the church, attended church probably 3 times a week, and went to Bible college and um, all kinds of Bible programs all my adult life. But for me to not understand some of these basic challenges to translation and what the translators are facing and the decisions that they make when they do the translation. For example, all of the masculine pronouns that we read in some very important passages like 1 Timothy 3. To understand that Greek, uh, they don't need pronouns because everything's included in the verb or the noun. But when it's translated to English, well, now we need a pronoun because English uses pronouns. So, we have choices. We could say one manages their home well, or we could say he manages his home well. Which do you
Hmm.
think they chose?
Pretty easy to figure that one out, I
Right.
think.
And so
Yeah.
we're
Yeah.
not being taught well. We're not learning these things well. We need better teaching. I don't want to be careful about, and some pull out 5 versions and compare them. You'll see some versions are no longer have all those masculine pronouns. But
Hmm.
even the NIV, which I think is possibly one of the better translations, they have removed those masculine pronouns out of, say, Romans 12, because they could see
Hmm.
that it was a default. But then they don't do it in 1 Timothy 3. And I'm
Yeah.
like, why not? That's inconsistent. It's because
Hmm.
they would get in hot water from all the complementarians. They would scream up to high heaven, "Don't buy this Bible. It's the feminist Bible." you know. So yeah, like you were saying earlier, there's a lot of politics involved.
It really is, and I think it does the church body a disservice in many ways. And I'll say this because I'm not advocating that any Bible college needs to be just thrown out. But that's extreme. Um, what I think is that there is a large difference between teaching someone how to be a disciple and teaching someone to be a follower. I think that because of, and I've said this before, so I'm not afraid to say it now. I think that because of the fact that power and money is involved, the way in which someone reads the Bible and interprets the Bible versus how they present it on stage as a lead pastor or a part of a team is going to be very different. They're often going to be very different because you don't want to upset the donors who are going to add the new wing to the church, and you don't want to see people leave the door because what you're teaching goes against their political ideology. And so it becomes problematic when you're worried about how people will perceive the biblical truth that you're trying to share with. I think that's more so for me. And I think it almost ties in perfectly with my next question for you, Lydia, and that has to do with chapter 15. Um, you connect certain power structures with abuse within the church. And I know that obviously that's a sensitive topic depending on which areas you're discussing, but what conversations do you hope this chapter opens up?
Well, the underlying problem in this entire issue is false ideas about authority. And I think
Mm-hmm.
it's because we, as human beings, we default to hierarchy. We look at businesses. If someone owns a business, they are responsible to make sure it runs well. It's their money. They can tell someone when to come to work and what to do. But Jesus wanted his kingdom to run differently. He wanted his church to be different. And by the second century, we were already headed off in the wrong direction by establishing a hierarchy. They had a single bishop over each major city. And we've continued with this very flawed, un-Jesus, I was going to say unbiblical, but I mean un-Jesus like, we've ignored what Jesus told us to do. Do we actually believe
Mm-hmm.
Jesus or not? He didn't just say, well, this is what I was told. Those verses in Matthew 20 and Mark 10, where Jesus says, look at the Gentiles and how they do things. They lord over each other and they exercise authority over each other, but not so among you. I was taught that meant, well, you have to exercise authority over each other, but don't do it in like a lording manner, that don't be a jerk about it. But no, he actually said, don't exercise authority over each other. And,
Yeah.
some people try to say, well, that particular word for authority, it has a preposition over, so that makes it especially ugly. No, exercising authority over someone is you can do it in a nice way. When you own a business, you can be a good boss and exercise authority over. It doesn't have to. There's no nice authority and negative authority in the church. There's just not plain old not supposed to be authority. And this
Mm-hmm.
sounds, if I've been told egalitarians just don't like authority. They're anti-authority. They just want chaos. Actually, we just need to trust the Holy Spirit. And again, in Ephesians 5, where it's talking about how a church should operate, and it says, submit one to another. All of Ephesians 5, that look at the context for the first 20 verses, it's talking about how to walk in mutuality and mutual respect and submitting one to another. And we take that and separate it out and again, ignore the command that everyone coming together needs to bring a teaching, a hymn, a prophecy, and so on. And you just can't do that in a large crowd of people. And because we have this got to build bigger and better mentality, then we lose the community that the early church had when they met in homes. And I'm just really fascinated right now with the microchurch movement and how you can get together in small groups in someone's home. And like you said, you don't have those worries about the money. How are we going to support this building? That puts a lot of pressure on the leadership and the decisions they're going to make. But when you don't have that pressure and one of your values is mutual respect, everybody gets to study the passage and bring what the Holy Spirit is teaching them instead of one person doing all the studying and everyone sits there and listens to the one person and think, wow, that was good. I could never do that.
Yeah, I Lydia, I love that so much. It's so interesting because you use the term mutualist throughout the book as opposed to egalitarian. And I'm gonna follow up with that in terms of asking you why that choice. But I wanted to say that what you're saying goes back to my argument. If it's an argument, I don't really argue. I'm curious. If we had decided as the church to make disciples as opposed to followers, because if that's the case, if you are teaching people to be disciples, then those disciples are going out to make more disciples, as opposed to followers who come back to see Lydia each week I've got to listen to Lydia. Lydia's got the word for me, as opposed to Lydia teaching me how to fish. And my job is now to go to teach others how to fish. And you have much smaller biblical or church communities, as opposed to these mega $1 million churches that when you ask the average person, how are you being fed? Like, how is your growth in the Bible? It stagnates.
Right. And when I talk about microchurch, a lot of people say, well, my big church, we have small groups. We have home groups. So we're doing that. They don't understand the essential difference. Those little groups are still beholden to that big church. They're being told what to talk about in their groups. Everybody's, vetted who gets to lead, and after a year, everyone has to do fruit basket upset and go to different groups so you can meet more new people, they say. What about the community you were establishing with those other people, those first people? And in a microchurch, there's more shared responsibility for everyone contributing, and there's shared responsibility for their future and what they do and the charity they do. And somebody else isn't handing down, okay, the elders have met and we've decided that this is going to be our charity emphasis for this year or something like that. It's like you were talking about teaching a man to fish instead of handing a man a fish. And your mega church, it's just too easy to come, plop in a pew and leave and not be involved, or get involved as someone who's just a very tiny cog in a bunch of wheels, rather than being forced to grow and take responsibility for your own growth and someone else's growth.
Yeah. Yeah. And the question is always, are you actually in community?
Right.
You're you're listening to music so loud that you can barely even understand what your neighbor might be saying to you. And then you got to be quiet when the pastor's talking. And then at the end, maybe you get 10 minutes because everybody's trying to shove each other out the front door to get home to watch the football game. So it's
right. And then at lunch, what was the sermon about? I think there was, I think I can come up with one point.
Or let me look at the handout, or let me check my phone real quick to see what. Yeah, I don't know. It's become a very diluted experience, and I'm not talking about myself. I'm talking about the church communities that I have seen. Now it's going to be different depending on the body that you go to, but it's when you're talking about the larger churches, it's the overwhelming majority have spoken to how diluted things have become.
Yeah, some churches will do better than others, but I feel like the basic model is corrupt from what we should be doing with community and becoming disciples and discipling others. And one of a secular writer from the first century, Celsus, criticized the church for being full of women and slaves, and also commented that they're doing all their recruiting at the laundries and the kitchens. This is where people were doing life together and talking. It was not happening out in big buildings where these critics could monitor things, and they didn't like that loss of control.
Yeah.
And Acts says that within 2 years, all of Asia heard the gospel. Why is that? It's because the women were preaching it in the laundries.
Yeah. It's an interesting place we're in right now. And I won't get into politics really on this. Just it is for individuals to not understand mutuality, which I'd love for you to just unpack that a little bit more for people versus egalitarian, because you use it in the book quite a bit. It is an eerie feeling for people who are seeing what's going on in the world, and they love Jesus, but at the same time they see how his name is being misused and abused. And I think that books like this, added with a long collection of books on how faith could be if we let go of power. If we, the Mekta Sidis has a beautiful book called A Just Mission, speaking about exactly that topic in the missions world. I look at how things could be, and sometimes it starts with reading a book like yours. So could you unpack a little bit of the mutuality just a little bit more for us?
There's not a lot to it. For one thing, a lot of people, when they hear the word egalitarian and complementarian, aren't familiar with those words. I mean, since I grew up with them, I thought they were as old as the hills. I didn't realize I was being taught a new doctrine. But egalitarian has kind of taken on a little bit of a negative life of its own, kind of like early feminism. It was a good term. Feminists just wanted women to be treated the same as the men. And then it over time, second, third, fourth waves, and some. If I call myself a feminist now, which I have no problem doing, except that someone will think I'm talking about that. I'm calling myself um, things that I'm not particularly on board with, that be considered, I would consider more radical. And so with egalitarian, again, the word has come to mean people who are almost are androgynous. They think that they say there's no difference between men and women. Well, I would say there's definitely a difference. God meant it that way. He loves diversity, and he wanted us to learn how to work together in that. And so I like mutualist because it's fewer syllables, a little easier to say and remember. And also, I like to just talk about mutual respect, mutual love, instead of oh, he needs respect and she needs love. No, we need to mutually respect and mutually love.
I think for me, labels are interesting. I know that words have power, but labels don't really mean anything except for you and for me. Like when you say feminist or feminine, okay, great. The strangest example I could have for you with regard to that is for me, and I'm literally writing a chapter in a book right now about this. At one point in my life, Lydia, I was a 6 foot, 180 pound guy who could run a 4.40, could jump 32 inches in the air, and could bench press 350 pounds. Yet I wasn't masculine enough for some of my friends. You understand what I'm saying?
Bulky.
So yeah, I just wasn't, the dominant male, the alpha male that they wanted me to be. But that's the thing. On every measurable thing, in terms of being a
You
man,
can still perform, right?
I was right. I was right there. I was a superior athlete to most of the men that I knew, and I still wasn't enough. I, knew all of these languages. I still wasn't enough. So I don't look at labels as much. I mean, explain who you are, and be eloquent with it. And, how people receive it is how they receive it. It doesn't change the work that you're doing, what you're trying to do for others, what you're trying to do for the church. Those things are, I don't argue with people anymore. I'm now 51 going on
and there's so
52.
much different perception based on what people have heard or where they're coming from. And so there's this broad range of meaning with just
Mhm.
about every term, so that you really do
Yeah,
have to ask, what do you mean by that? What does that mean to
yeah,
you? Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. So, well, Lydia, this has been amazing. I'm going to make sure, guys, that we put Lydia's information in the show notes. But other than what we place in the show notes, Lydia, how can people learn more about your work and keep up with you?
They can go to my website, lydiakaiser.com. And I have a Substack, and
Nice.
yeah, just please get my book and leave me an Amazon review so that it keeps showing it to other people, and share it with others. I'd love to see some people do a Bible study with it. I feel like the introductory matter by itself is like a mini hermeneutics course. I felt like I needed to cover that before going into all the commentary about the translations and interpretation, so that people had a basic knowledge, and it will help them with other Bible studies.
Outstanding. Well, thank you so much for being on the show, and I can't wait. I'm halfway through the book. I can't wait to get through the rest of it here, but this was wonderful. Thank you so much, Lydia.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
The Unbroken Place podcast is presented by Eddie Paul Thomas, LLC, and sponsored by Elevate One Consulting and OK on Second Thought Coaching. The show is produced by Say Something Studios. Learn more about our sponsors and producer in the show notes. The show's music is performed by Kesta. Thank you for being a part of the Unbroken Place podcast community. Look for an ongoing conversation on TikTok, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. And make sure to sign up for our newsletter called Things I'm Rethinking at eddiepaulthomas.com. Until next time, one love.